It was a Friday night in October, the kind of quiet small-town night where the air feels heavier than it should, like it's holding secrets you don't want to uncover. I was house-sitting for my aunt and uncle while they were off celebrating their anniversary in Cancun. Their house sat at the very edge of town, right where the rows of suburban houses give way to endless fields of corn. I didn't mind being there alone. It felt peaceful, even cozy. The neighbors, the Montgomerys, lived just across the field, and their house was the only one visible from my aunt's place. It was comforting knowing they were there, just in case. That night, I'd made myself some popcorn and settled into the couch with my phone and a horror movie playing in the background. Cliché, right? But horror movies have this way of making everything outside your window feel closer. I was scrolling through my texts when I noticed it. A faint tapping noise coming from the back of the house. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Tap, tap, pause, tap. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a branch against the window. It was breezy after all. But as I got up to check, the sound stopped. Completely. The way silence does when it knows you're listening. I walked to the back door, flicked on the outside light, and stared out into the yard. It was empty, just the faint glow of the Montgomery's porch light across the field in the distance. Shrugging it off, I went back to the couch and decided I'd switch to YouTube videos instead. Something less creepy. But the moment I sat down, it started again. Tap, tap, tap. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the back of the house. It was coming from the window by the front porch. All right, that's enough, I muttered to myself, grabbing my phone to use as a flashlight. It had to be a prank, some bored teenagers from town. I flung open the front door, letting in a burst of cold night air. The porch was empty. Seriously? I muttered, stepping out to take a better look. My breath hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt stupid, until I noticed it. There was something in the yard, halfway between me and the cornfield. It looked like a person, crouched low, unmoving. They were just a black outline against the amber streetlight from the Montgomery's property. Hello! My voice cracked slightly. The figure didn't move. The hair on my neck prickled. I took a shaky step backward, back onto the porch. As I did, the figure straightened up, jerkily, unnaturally, like a puppet yanked to its feet. And then it started walking toward me. I slammed the door shut so hard the walls rattled. My fingers fumbled for the lock, twisting it into place with shaking hands. My heart was hammering in my chest as I backed away from the door, clutching my phone like it was a weapon. I didn't know what I'd just seen out there, but the way it moved wasn't right. People don't stand like that. People don't walk like that. The tap-tap started again. Not from the front door this time, but from the side of the house. The window next to the kitchen. I froze, staring at the reflection of the room in the dark glass. At first, it was just me, wide-eyed and pale, standing in the dim light of the kitchen. But then something shifted. A shadow moved on the other side. Slowly, deliberately, I crept closer, one step at a time, my socks silent on the wooden floor. My phone's flashlight wasn't on, and I wasn't about to turn it on now and give away exactly where I was. I stayed low, trying to peer around the corner of the window. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I was inches from the window now. If I moved just a bit closer, I'd be able to see outside. My heart felt like it was climbing into my throat. I took a deep breath and leaned forward, just enough to. The glass shattered. A pale hand shot through the jagged hole in the window, groping wildly, the fingers long and too thin, the nails cracked and yellowed. I screamed, stumbling back as the hand scraped against the edge of the counter. The thing on the other side let out this awful, guttural noise, like it was choking on gravel. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a frying pan from the counter, and swung it as hard as I could at the hand. There was a wet, sickening crack, and the arm retracted immediately, yanked back into the darkness outside. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. The attic, that's where I'd go. It had a door that locked, and a small window I could climb out of if I had to. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it wasn't on a window. It was on the front door. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping was slow, deliberate, almost mocking. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't in a rush. It knew I was trapped inside, and it wanted me to know it too. Tap, tap, tap. Then it stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, and just as I began to think maybe it had gone, I heard the handle of the front door rattle. Slowly at first, then harder, more aggressive. My mind raced. I hadn't just locked the door. I knew I had, but the sound of metal scraping and twisting made my stomach drop. It was trying to pick the lock. Think, 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 I whispered to myself. My aunt and uncle had always been paranoid about home security. There was a baseball bat under the couch downstairs and a shotgun locked in their bedroom closet. The key was probably still in the drawer of their nightstand. But going downstairs was out of the question. Whatever that thing was, it was down there, just on the other side of the door. The attic. That was my only option. I sprinted down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounding deafening in the oppressive quiet. I flung the attic door open and hauled myself up the ladder, slamming it shut behind me and locking it with the flimsy latch. The attic was cold, and the dim light of my phone barely illuminated the dusty space. I stumbled over old furniture and boxes, searching for something, anything, that could help me. My hands landed on a rusted crowbar leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it felt solid in my grip. I crawled over to the small attic window, the one facing the Montgomery's house. My fingers fumbled with the latch, pushing it open to let the night air in. Maybe I could scream, wave my phone's flashlight, something to get their attention. But when I looked out across the field, my blood ran cold. Their house was dark, completely dark. No porch light, no glow from inside. Just an empty, silent shape against the black sky. My breath fogged the glass as I stared, desperate for any sign of life. A flicker of movement caught my eye near the edge of their yard. My stomach turned as I realized what I was seeing. There were more of them, figures, barely visible in the moonlight, moving slowly through the field, their bodies jerking in that unnatural, puppet-like way. They weren't heading for the Montgomery's house. They were heading for mine. The front door slammed open downstairs, and I bit down on my scream. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, shaking the floor beneath me. My heart was in my throat as I gripped the crowbar tighter, trying to steady my trembling hands. Something or things was inside now. I couldn't hear footsteps, but there was movement. A slow, deliberate creaking of the wooden floorboards below, like the weight of whatever had entered was dragging across the room. It wasn't rushing. It was searching, and it knew I was here. The attic was silent except for my shallow breathing. I stayed by the window, watching the dark shapes in the field creep closer. Their numbers were growing. First there were 3, then 5, and now there had to be at least a dozen, their silhouettes swaying and jerking as they moved toward the house. A thud came from directly beneath me. I froze. Then another, and another. It was coming up the stairs. I backed away from the attic window, crawling into the corner behind a stack of boxes. My mind was screaming at me to do something. Fight, run, anything. But my body felt locked in place, like I was tied down by the weight of my own fear. The ladder creaked, slowly, methodically. It was climbing. The light from my phone reflected off the crowbar in my shaking hands, and for a second, I thought about trying to fight it. But what good would that do? I'd seen that hand, the way it moved, the wrongness of it. Whatever was coming up that ladder wasn't something I could fight off with a rusty piece of metal. The latch on the attic door rattled. Once, twice, and then it clicked open. I stifled a scream as the door swung upward. The thing's head emerged first, pale and elongated, with sunken, shadowed eyes that seemed to drink in the darkness around them. Its jaw hung loose, like it was unhinged, and the faint, wheezing sound of its breath filled the attic. Its body followed, dragging itself up onto the floor, its limbs bending at impossible angles. I pressed myself further into the corner, trying to make myself invisible as it rose to its full height, its head almost brushing the sloped ceiling. Turned, scanning the attic. Its neck cracked as it moved, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were milky and unfocused, yet somehow they felt like they could see everything. Then it stopped. Its head tilted, and it sniffed the air. It knew I was here. I couldn't hold back the whimper that escaped my throat, and in that instant, its head snapped toward me with inhuman speed. It grinned, not a smile, a full, tooth-bearing, predatory grin that stretched far too wide for its face. The thing lunged forward, and I screamed, swinging the crowbar as hard as I could. The metal connected with its shoulder, the impact vibrating painfully up my arm. It stumbled back, letting out a guttural screech that made my ears ring. I didn't wait for it to recover. I bolted toward the attic window, shoving it open and climbing out onto the roof. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I scrambled onto the steep slope, my bare feet slipping against the shingles. Below me, the field was alive with movement. The figures were closing in, their jerky movements becoming faster, more deliberate. There were so many of them now, all converging on the house. Behind me, the thing in the attic let out another screech. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. I ran along the roof, heading for the tree that stretched close to the side of the house. The screeching grew louder, closer. It was chasing me. I reached the tree and jumped, grabbing hold of one of the lower branches. The bark scraped against my palms as I climbed down as fast as I could, nearly losing my grip more than once. I hit the ground running, sprinting toward the Montgomery's house with no real plan. No idea what I'd do when I got there. But I didn't make it far. One of the figures emerged from the shadows in front of me, its long arms reaching out. I skidded to a stop, turning to run back the other way, but another figure appeared. And another. They were surrounding me, their blank faces turned toward me, their movements impossibly synchronized. I backed away, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The figures closed in, and I raised the crowbar, ready to swing. A blinding light flooded the field, and the figures froze. The sound of an engine roared to life, and I turned to see a pair of headlights barreling toward us. A truck. The Montgomery's truck. The figures began to scatter, their jerky movements losing their rhythm. The truck skidded to a stop beside me, and the driver's door flew open. "Get in!" Mr. Montgomery shouted. I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the truck, slamming the door shut as he floored the gas pedal. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and the truck lurched forward, speeding away from the house and the nightmare I just barely escaped. I looked back through the rear window, watching as the figures faded into the darkness. "Jesus Christ," Mr. Montgomery muttered. "What the hell were those things?" I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. But as the house disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were, this wasn't over. We didn't stop driving until the town lights were just a distant glow in the rearview mirror. The road stretched out ahead of us, surrounded by thick woods on either side. My hands were trembling in my lap, the crowbar still gripped so tightly that my knuckles were white. Mr. Montgomery glanced at me from the driver's seat, his jaw clenched, his own knuckles tight on the steering wheel. "You're gonna have to tell me what the hell's going on," he said, his voice strained but steady. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What could I even say? That something inhuman had broken into my aunt's house? That there were things out in the fields that moved like broken marionettes? I don't know. I finally stammered. I was alone in the house. There was tapping on the windows. And then my voice broke as I thought about that thing in the attic, the way it had grinned at me. It got inside. Mr. Montgomery nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the road. "Those things, they've been in the fields before," he said after a long pause. His voice was low, like he didn't want to say it out loud. "I've seen him, just shadows, though. Never this close." "What do you mean, you've seen them?" I turned to him, my voice rising in panic. He sighed, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Couple months back, I noticed lights out in the fields. Thought it was just kids messing around. But when I went to check, there was nothing there. No tracks. No signs anyone had been there. Then, a few nights later, I saw 'em. Figures moving out by the corn. Didn't think much of it at first. Could have been anything. But they don't move right. And they don't leave tracks. I stared at him, my mind spinning. Why didn't you tell anyone? He laughed bitterly. Who would I tell? The sheriff? What am I supposed to say? Hey, there's a bunch of creepy shadows wandering around my cornfield. Can you send someone out? He shook his head. Nobody'd believe me. Hell, I didn't believe it until tonight. We drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine the only sound. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I fumbled to pull it out, my hands shaking. A notification popped up, an emergency alert. Unidentified disturbance in your area. Stay indoors. Avoid contact with unknown individuals. If you experience unusual activity, report immediately to local authorities. My stomach dropped. I showed the screen to Mr. Montgomery, and his face went pale. This is bigger than just us, he muttered. He turned the truck off the main road, pulling into the parking lot of a gas station that looked as old as the town itself. The neon open sign flickered weakly in the window, but the place was deserted. Why are we stopping? I asked, panic creeping into my voice. Need to call someone. Sheriff, maybe. Someone's gotta know what's going on. He cut the engine and reached for his phone, but I grabbed his arm. Don't leave me alone. My voice was barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then nodded. All right, stay close. We stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at my skin. The gas station was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Mr. Montgomery pushed the door open, and the little bell jingled. Hello? He called out. His voice echoed in the empty store. No answer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I clutched the crowbar tighter, my eyes darting to every shadow. Something didn't feel right. The shelves were stocked, the lights were on, but there was no one here. Let's just go, I whispered. But Mr. Montgomery was already heading for the counter. That's when I saw it. Behind the counter, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure crouched low to the ground. At first, I thought it was a person, a clerk hiding, maybe, but then it moved. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending the wrong way as it unfolded itself, rising to its full height. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was smooth and featureless like a mannequin. It tilted its head, as if studying us, and then it stepped out from behind the counter. Run, I whispered, grabbing Mr. Montgomery's arm. Run. The thing let out a low, guttural noise, and then it charged. We bolted for the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The thing moved fast, faster than anything that should have been able to move on those twisted limbs. We barely made it out, slamming the door behind us and jumping into the truck. Go, go, go! I screamed as Mr. Montgomery started the engine. The thing was at the window now, slamming its distorted hands against the glass, its smooth face pressed against it like it was trying to see inside. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching, and the thing fell back into the gravel as we sped away. I twisted in my seat, watching it shrink into the distance. But before it disappeared entirely, I saw it turn and walk back toward the gas station. And in the faint glow of the flickering lights, I saw more figures emerging from the shadows, one by one, their movements slow and deliberate as they joined it. We didn't speak for a long time after leaving the gas station. The road stretched out ahead of us, endless and dark, with only the truck's headlights carving a path through the night. Mr. Montgomery's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, and I stared out the window, clutching the crowbar so tightly my arms ached. They're everywhere, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, Mr. Montgomery muttered. I don't think this is just our town anymore. The emergency alert on my phone replayed in my mind. Unusual activity. That was putting it mildly. Whatever these things were, they weren't natural. They weren't human. And they were spreading. What do we do now? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, there's a police station about 15 miles up the road. We head there. They've got weapons, backup, something. We're not gonna make it on our own. The idea of being around other people felt like a lifeline. But a part of me wondered if the police station would even help. Would they believe us? Could they even stop those things? The truck's headlights hit a figure in the middle of the road, and Mr. Montgomery slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, and I lurched forward, gripping the dashboard as the truck skidded to a halt. The figure stood motionless in the beams of light. At first, I thought it was one of them, but something was different. It was a man, his face pale and gaunt, dressed in ragged clothes. His hands were held up, palms out in a gesture of surrender. "Help me!" he shouted, his voice cracked and desperate. "Please, let me in." Mr. Montgomery hesitated, his hand hovering over the gearshift. "What if he's, He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Let's just go," I whispered. Every instinct in my body was screaming to drive, to leave him behind. But the man stepped closer, stumbling toward the truck. "Please, they're coming. They're right behind me." And then I saw it. In the faint glow of the headlights, just behind the man, the shadows were moving. Figures emerged from the edges of the road, their distorted shapes swaying unnaturally as they closed in. "Drive!" I screamed, but it was too late. The man was at the passenger side window now, pounding on the glass. "Don't leave me, please." I looked at Mr. Montgomery, and for a moment we both froze. Then, with a resigned sigh, he unlocked the door. "Get in, quick." The man yanked the door open and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind him. "Go! Go!" he shouted, and Mr. Montgomery hit the gas. The truck roared forward, and I watched as the figures on the road faded into the darkness behind us. My chest was heaving, my heart racing so hard it hurt. The man was gasping for air, clutching his chest. "Thank you," he muttered. "Thank you for stopping. I thought I was done for." "Who are you?" Mr. Montgomery asked, his voice tense. "Brian," the man said. I was at the diner in town when they showed up. They just started walking in one by one like they owned the place. Everyone thought it was a prank until they started." He trailed off, his eyes hollow. "Until they started taking people." My stomach churned. "Taking people? What do you mean?" "They don't kill them," Brian said, his voice shaking. "Not at first. They just stand there staring. And then the people they're looking at, they freeze up, like they're in a trance. And then they just go with them." "Go where?" Mr. Montgomery asked. Brian shook his head. "I don't know. They just walk off into the dark, and they don't come back." The truck fell into silence again, the weight of his words pressing down on all of us. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. These things didn't just kill, they changed people, took them, made them into something else. The police station came into view up ahead, a small brick building with a few squad cars parked out front. Relief flooded through me at the sight of it. "We'll be safe here," Mr. Montgomery said, pulling into the lot. But as we approached, the headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. The station door was wide open, hanging crookedly on its hinges. One of the squad cars had its driver's side door open, the lights still flashing. And in the parking lot, slumped over on the pavement, were two bodies. We stopped the truck, and for a moment none of us moved. The station was silent, the air thick with a tension I couldn't explain. "Stay here," Mr. Montgomery said, reaching under the seat and pulling out a revolver. "If something happens, you take this truck and you drive." "Are you crazy? You're not going in there." I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off. "I need to see if anyone's still alive," he said, his voice firm. "Lock the doors behind me." I watched as he stepped out of the truck, the gun steady in his hand. He disappeared into the station, leaving me and Brian alone in the truck. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. The stillness of the parking lot was unbearable. And then I saw it. From the dark woods across the street, the shadows were moving again. Figures were emerging, dozens of them, their distorted shapes swaying as they advanced toward the station. "Brian?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "They're coming." He turned to look, his face pale. Oh God, we're trapped." Brian was hyperventilating beside me, muttering under his breath, but I couldn't focus on him. My eyes were locked on the figures emerging from the woods. There were so many of them now, too many to count. They moved in that same jerky way, like marionettes with invisible strings, but their pace was quickening. They were coming straight for us. "We can't just sit here," I hissed, gripping the crowbar tightly. "We have to do something." "What?" Brian snapped, his voice cracking. "We can't fight them. There's too many. We need to run." Before I could respond, the truck's radio crackled to life, startling both of us. A garbled voice came through, barely audible over the static. "All units, evacuate unidentified hostile entities. Avoid direct contact." I reached for the radio, but Brian grabbed my wrist, his face pale. "It's too late. They're already here." I followed his gaze and my stomach dropped. The first of the figures had reached the edge of the parking lot. It paused for a moment, tilting its head like it was sniffing the air, before taking another shuddering step forward. Behind it, more figures poured out of the shadows, spreading out like a wave. They were everywhere, by the cars, near the station, even circling toward the truck. We were surrounded. The passenger side door handle rattled, and Brian let out a strangled scream, scrambling away from the door. I spun around, my heart pounding, as one of the figures pressed its face, smooth and featureless, against the glass. Its hand twisted the handle again, testing it. "Lock the doors," I whispered to myself, my hand trembling as I checked the locks. "Stay locked. Stay locked." A gunshot echoed from inside the station. I jumped, my pulse skyrocketing, and looked toward the open door. Another shot rang out, and then another. "Montgomery?" I whispered, my voice shaking. I wanted to believe he was still alive, that he was fighting back, but deep down, I knew the truth. He wasn't coming back. The figure at the window stopped rattling the handle. Its head turned, almost like it was listening, and then, with slow, deliberate movements, it stepped away from the truck. "What's it doing?" Brian whispered, his voice trembling. The figure joined the others, who were now standing in a loose circle around the station. They weren't moving anymore. They were just standing there, completely still, their heads tilted toward the building. The tension in the air was suffocating. Felt like the entire world was holding its breath. And then the lights inside the station flickered. I grabbed Brian's arm. "Get ready to run." "What?" he stammered, his eyes wide. "We'll never make it. If we stay here, we're dead," I snapped. "When they go inside, we run for the woods." "Got it." He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told me he understood. The lights flickered again, and then they went out entirely. For a moment, the parking lot was plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the truck's dashboard. Then the figures moved. They surged toward the station in unison, their movements sudden and violent. The air filled with the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood as they poured through the doors and windows, disappearing into the dark interior of the building. "Now!" I shouted, throwing open the driver's side door. Brian and I bolted from the truck, sprinting across the lot toward the tree line. My legs felt like lead, every step an agonizing effort, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind us, the station was a cacophony of crashes and guttural screeches. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but they were our only chance. I could hear Brian's panicked breaths behind me, and I prayed he wouldn't trip or fall. We hit the trees and kept running, the underbrush tearing at my legs. The darkness swallowed us, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. The sounds of the station faded as we ran deeper into the woods. The air was cold and damp, and the only light came from the faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the trees. Finally, when my lungs felt like they were about to give out, I stopped. Brian stumbled to a halt beside me, collapsing against a tree and gasping for air. Do you think they saw us?" he panted. I listened, my ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The woods were silent, except for the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. We stayed there for a while, catching our breath, the the silence pressing down on us like a weight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. What were those things? Why were they here? And why did they take people? Brian suddenly stiffened, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" I froze, holding my breath. First, I heard nothing. But then, faintly, it came. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They were coming. I grabbed Brian's arm and pulled him to his feet. "We have to keep moving." "But, move," I hissed, dragging him deeper into the woods. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. We ran, the trees blurring together as panic drove us forward. And then, up ahead, I saw it. A faint light cutting through the darkness. It wasn't like the glow of the station or the headlights of the truck. It was soft, warm, and steady. Hope surged in my chest. "There's something ahead," I shouted. We sprinted toward the light, desperation driving us forward. But as we got closer, I felt the hope drain away, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. The light wasn't coming from a house or a street lamp. It was coming from one of them. The glow ahead pulsed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the trees. Brian slowed down, pulling on my arm as panic twisted his features. "It's them," he gasped. "We're running right toward them." I stopped, my chest heaving as I turned to look behind us. The woods were alive with movement, faint shadows swaying and twisting in the dark. The footsteps were louder now, closing in from all directions. We were surrounded. "What do we do?" Brian whimpered, his voice cracking. "We're trapped." My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. The glow ahead was getting closer, brighter, as if it knew we were coming. I gripped the crowbar so tightly my knuckles ached, and then I did the only thing I could think of. "We keep going," I said, my voice trembling but firm. Brian's eyes widened. "Are you insane? That's suicide. Staying here is suicide," I snapped, grabbing his arm and dragging him forward. "If we stop now, they'll take us. I'm not letting that happen." We pushed forward, the glow growing brighter with every step. The air around it felt wrong, heavy and charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, the guttural noises echoing through the trees. I didn't dare look back. And then we saw it. The source of the light wasn't a single figure. It was many. They stood in a loose circle in a small clearing, their distorted bodies swaying in unison. Their featureless faces turned toward the center, where the light seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The air shimmered above the light, like heat rising from pavement, and within the shimmer, there was something. It was hard to describe, like a shape that didn't fully exist in this world. My eyes struggled to focus on it, and the longer I looked, the more my head ached. Brian let out a strangled sob, his legs buckling beneath him. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer, couldn't. My mind refused to comprehend what I was seeing. The figures in the circle didn't react to us. They continued their slow, swaying movements, as if they were in a trance. But the light pulsed brighter, and the shimmer above it began to ripple, growing larger. A deep, resonating hum filled the clearing, vibrating through my chest. I clutched the crowbar, my instinct to run battling with the paralyzing fear that rooted me in place. Then one of the figures turned. It didn't move like the others. It turned smoothly, deliberately, its head tilting as it looked directly at me. For the first time, I felt its gaze, cold, heavy, and inescapable. It didn't have eyes, but I knew it could see me. The hum grew louder, and the other figures began to turn as well, one by one, until the entire circle was facing us. The light pulsed brighter, casting their distorted shadows across the trees. "We're going to die," Brian whispered, tears streaming down his face. "This is it. We're dead." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "Not like this." The shimmer above the light began to take form, shifting and twisting into something almost human, but impossibly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body rippling like liquid, and its face, if you could call it that, was a hollow void. I took a step back, my grip tightening on the crowbar. "Brian, when I say run, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back." He shook his head frantically. "I can't." "Yes, you can," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I'll distract them. Just go." Before he could argue, the thing in the shimmer moved. Its hollow face turned toward me, and the light around it dimmed, as if it were sucking the energy from the air itself. The figures began to advance, their jerky movements synchronized as they stepped closer. "Run!" I screamed, and I swung the crowbar as hard as I could. The metal connected with one of the figures, and it crumpled like a paper doll, its body folding unnaturally as it hit the ground. But the others didn't stop. They closed in, their movements faster now, more coordinated. Brian took off, stumbling through the trees, and I prayed he'd make it. The figures surrounded me, their featureless faces inches from mine. The light pulsed again, and the thing in the shimmer reached out, its liquid-like limb extending toward me. I swung the crowbar wildly, but it passed through the limb like smoke. The hum grew deafening, and I felt my body being pulled toward the light, an invisible force dragging me closer. My feet slid across the ground as I fought against it, screaming, but it was too strong. This was it. I was going to die. And then, out of nowhere, a deafening crack echoed through the clearing. The light flickered, and the pull on my body released. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, as the figures around me froze. Another crack rang out, followed by a flash of light. I looked up, and through the trees, I saw a figure holding a shotgun. It was Mr. Montgomery. "Get up!" he shouted, firing another shot at the thing in the shimmer. The blast hit the ground near the light, and the figures recoiled, their bodies twitching violently. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet and ran, stumbling toward him as he fired again and again. The light began to dim, and the shimmer wavered, its form collapsing in on itself. "Come on!" he yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me into the trees. Behind us, the clearing erupted in chaos. The figures thrashed and convulsed, their bodies collapsing like puppets with severed strings. The hum grew louder, building to a crescendo, and then silence. We didn't stop running until the first faint light of dawn broke through the trees. By the time the sun began to rise, we'd reached the edge of the woods. Mr. Montgomery and I collapsed against an old, rusted fence, both of us gasping for air. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my throat burned from the cold night air. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The morning light crept over the fields, bathing everything in a soft, golden glow. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The warmth of the sun couldn't erase the memory of what we'd just seen. "Brian," I finally croaked, my voice raw. "Did he make it?" Mr. Montgomery shook his head grimly. "Didn't see him. He's either out there somewhere or..." He trailed off, staring at the horizon. The thought of Brian alone in those woods, or worse, in the hands of those things, sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I leaned against the fence, my head spinning. "What the hell were those things?" I whispered. "And that light?" Mr. Montgomery didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flask, taking a long drink before passing it to me. I hesitated, then took a swig, the burn of the liquor steadying my nerves. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "I've been on this earth a long time and I've seen some weird shit, but nothing like this. Whatever they are, they're not human. And that light, that wasn't natural. Felt like it was pulling me apart just standing near it." I nodded silently, the memory of the shimmer and its hollow, shifting form sending chills down my spine. "You saved me," I said after a moment. "Back there. I thought I was done for." He gave me a weary smile. "You're tougher than you look, kid. You held your ground longer than most would've." I wanted to feel proud of that, but all I felt was exhausted. My hands were still shaking, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving a bone-deep fatigue in its place. "What now?" I asked. "What do we do?" Mr. Montgomery stood, brushing dirt off his jeans. "We find help. Real help. Not the cops, not the locals. Someone who'll actually believe us. He turned to me, his eyes hard. And we warn people. Whatever's happening here, it's spreading. If we don't stop it, there won't be any place left to run. The idea of going back into town, of facing those things again, made my stomach twist. But he was right. We couldn't just leave and pretend this never happened. What if it's too late? I asked quietly. What if they've already taken over? Mr. Montgomery's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then he placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. Then we fight, he said simply. We fight like hell. We made our way back to the road, sticking close to the tree line in case any of the creatures were still out there. The town was eerily quiet when we reached it, the streets empty and the houses dark. It was like everyone had vanished overnight. We found Brian's truck on the outskirts of town, its doors hanging open and the engine still running. There was no sign of him. "I'll take it," Mr. Montgomery said, climbing into the driver's seat. Faster than walking. He looked at me. "You coming?" I hesitated, glancing back toward the woods. Part of me wanted to run as far away as possible, to find someplace safe and never look back. But another part of me knew there was no escaping this. Whatever those things were, they weren't going to stop, and neither could we. I climbed into the truck, and Mr. Montgomery started the engine. As we drove away from the town, I looked back one last time. The streets were still empty, but in the distance, I thought I saw movement. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the woods, watching us go. I turned away, my heart heavy. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Weeks turned into months, and the world started to fracture. It began quietly. Small towns, places just like ours, disappeared overnight. No struggle, no chaos, just eerie silence where life had once been. Reports of strange lights in the sky and figures in the woods filtered through the news, dismissed as hoaxes or mass hysteria. But those of us who'd seen it firsthand knew the truth. They were taking us one piece at a time. Mr. Montgomery and I stayed on the move, hopping from town to town, always keeping one step ahead of whatever was coming. We tried to warn people, but no one wanted to listen. It was easier for them to believe it was nothing than to face the horrifying reality. We weren't alone for long, though. Others like us, survivors, started to emerge. We found them on the fringes of society. Drifters, ex-soldiers, conspiracy theorists who'd finally been proven right. They told their stories in hushed tones, all eerily similar to ours. Lights, figures, that thing in the shimmer. We began to piece together the pattern. The lights weren't random, they were deliberate. They appeared in isolated places first, towns too small and too disconnected to draw immediate attention. And the people they took weren't killed. They were changed. The replacements, as we started calling them, were everywhere. They looked human, moved like humans, mostly. But there was something off, something hollow. They didn't smile. They didn't laugh. And they always seemed to be watching. It wasn't long before the replacements outnumbered the rest of us. One cold December night, we set up camp in an abandoned farmhouse a few miles outside a town called Millhaven. There were 6 of us now, me, Mr. Montgomery, and a handful of others we'd picked up along the way. Brian hadn't made it, and we didn't talk about him much. It was easier that way. The farmhouse was falling apart, but it was quiet, and we needed the rest. We boarded up the windows, rigged makeshift alarms out of cans and fishing line, and took turns keeping watch. I was on the second shift, sitting by the window with a shotgun across my lap and a flashlight in my hand. The night was bitterly cold, the air so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the frost-covered glass. But it grew brighter, and I knew immediately what it was. I shook Mr. Montgomery awake, my voice low but urgent. "They're here." He was up in an instant, grabbing his rifle and rousing the others. We'd done this before, packed up and run at the first sign of danger. But this time, something felt different. The glow wasn't stationary. It was moving, faster than it ever had before. "They're pushing us," Montgomery muttered as he peered out the window, "driving us into something." "What do you mean?" I asked, my chest tightening. He didn't answer, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. We scrambled to gather our supplies, but before we could leave, the ground began to vibrate. It was subtle at first, like the rumble of a distant train, but it grew stronger, shaking the walls of the farmhouse and rattling the boarded-up windows. "What the hell is that?" One of the others, an older man named Carter, whispered. None of us had an answer. The glow outside grew blinding, and then, without warning, the farmhouse was bathed in an intense white light. It wasn't just coming from one direction anymore. It was everywhere, pouring in through every crack and gap in the walls. The air felt heavy, electric, like it was pressing down on us. "Don't look at it," Montgomery shouted, pulling me away from the window. "Whatever you do, don't look at the light." But it was too late. One of the others, a woman named Sandy, had already turned toward the window. Her eyes went wide, her face slack, and she dropped to her knees. "Sandy!" I screamed, but she didn't respond. She just stared, unblinking, as tears streamed down her face. And then she stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. She turned toward us, her eyes blank, and started walking. "Don't let her near you," Montgomery barked, raising his rifle. I wanted to stop him, to shout at him that it was still Sandy, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Not anymore. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space, and Sandy crumpled to the floor. The light outside pulsed, growing impossibly brighter. I felt it pulling at me, dragging me toward the windows, and I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to look away. "We have to go," Montgomery yelled, grabbing my arm and dragging me toward the back door. The others followed, but the farmhouse felt like a maze, the light disorienting us, twisting the space around us. We burst out into the freezing night, only to stop dead in our tracks. They were waiting for us. Dozens of figures stood in the snow, their featureless faces turned toward us. Behind them, the shimmering void loomed, larger than I'd ever seen it. The hum filled the air, vibrating through my skull, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head. This was it. This was how it ended. But then I heard it, a deafening roar that drowned out the hum. A truck barreled through the figures, scattering them like bowling pins. The door flew open, and a voice I didn't recognize shouted, "Get in!" Montgomery grabbed me, hauling me to my feet, and we scrambled into the truck. The others followed, and as soon as the last of us was inside, the driver floored it, speeding away from the farmhouse and into the dark. I looked back just in time to see the figures regroup, their heads turning in unison to watch us go. The light behind them pulsed once more, and then it was gone. We didn't ask the driver his name. We didn't ask where he came from or how he'd found us. All we knew was that we were alive, for now. But as the truck sped into the unknown, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only delaying the inevitable. They weren't going to stop, not until they'd taken everything. And no matter how far we ran, we couldn't outrun the light. The truck roared down the icy highway, the hum of the void fading into the distance behind us. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Mr. Montgomery sat next to me, his rifle clutched in his lap, his jaw set in grim determination. The driver, a wiry, scarred man in his 40s, kept his eyes on the road, the tension in his face betraying his fear. "We can't keep running," Montgomery muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "We've been running for months, and it hasn't stopped them. They're just getting stronger." He was right. No matter how far we went, how many nights we spent in the woods or boarded up houses, the light always found us. It wasn't just chasing us. It was consuming everything in its path. The driver, who still hadn't told us his name, broke the silence. "There's a place," he said, his voice rough, "north of here, old military base, decommissioned but still armed. A group's been holed up there, fighting back. They've got weapons, resources, people who know what they're doing." I perked up at his words. "They're fighting? Against those things?" The man nodded, his eyes never leaving the road. They've taken out some of the smaller ones. The lights, the figures. But they're not just trying to kill them. They're trying to figure out what they are, and how to stop them for good. Why haven't we heard about this before? Montgomery asked, his tone skeptical. Because the replacements don't want you to, the man replied simply. They're in control now. The media, the police, the government, they've infiltrated everything. If you're still human, you're already a target. The weight of his words settled over us, heavy and suffocating. I glanced at Montgomery, who was staring out the window, his face unreadable. Do we have a choice? I asked softly. No, Montgomery said. We don't. The base wasn't easy to find. It was buried deep in the forest, hidden by winding dirt roads and camouflaged fencing. As we approached, we were met with armed guards, their faces weathered but human. They scanned us with devices that glowed blue, nodding in approval when nothing unusual appeared on their screens. Inside, the base was a hive of activity. People moved purposefully, carrying weapons, setting up barricades, monitoring screens filled with maps and glowing anomalies. It was the first time in months I felt something resembling hope. A woman approached us, tall and sharp-eyed, her dark hair pulled into a tight braid. She introduced herself as Captain Moore, the leader of the resistance. Her expression was no nonsense, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes that reminded me of Montgomery. You've seen them, she said, not as a question but as a statement. We've seen enough, Montgomery replied. We've been running, but it's not enough. We need to fight. Moore nodded. Good, because running won't save anyone. They're everywhere now, and if we don't find a way to stop them soon, there won't be anything left. She led us to a war room, its walls covered in maps and photographs of the lights, the figures, the replacements. In the center of the room, a glowing orb floated inside a reinforced glass chamber, pulsing faintly. What is that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Moore's jaw tightened. We call it a shard. It's a piece of whatever's out there, a fragment of the light. We managed to trap it during one of their appearances. It's not alive, not exactly, but it reacts to us, to our presence. We're studying it, trying to understand how it works. Montgomery leaned closer, his brow furrowed. And? What have you found? Moore hesitated, then sighed. We think they're building something. The lights, the figures, the replacements, it's all part of a larger system. They're reshaping our world, turning it into something else. We don't know why, but we know it's accelerating. The room fell silent. The enormity of what she was saying hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just invading. They were changing everything piece by piece. So how do we stop them? Montgomery asked, his voice steady. Moore's eyes hardened. We go to the source. The larger light forms, the ones that shimmer, the ones you've seen. They're connected to all of it. If we can destroy them, we might be able to cut off their influence. But getting close enough to one of them. Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. It was suicide. The next night, we were woken by alarms. The lights had found us. Chaos erupted in the base as people scrambled to defend themselves. The guards held the perimeter, firing at the advancing figures, but there were too many. The replacements moved through the forest like shadows, their featureless faces glowing faintly in the dark. Montgomery grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the war room. We have to protect the shard, he said. It's the only leverage we've got. When we reached the chamber, Moore was already there, her face set in grim determination. They're coming for it, she said. They know we have it. The shard pulsed violently, its glow flickering as if it were alive. Outside, the hum of the void grew louder, shaking the walls of the base. They won't stop until they take this place, Moore said, her voice sharp. We have one chance. We use the shard to lure them out, and then we destroy it. Montgomery nodded. How? Moore handed him a detonator. We've rigged the chamber with explosives. If we can get the shard into one of their larger forms, the explosion might disrupt their entire system. But someone has to get close enough to deliver it. I'll do it, Montgomery said without hesitation. No, I said, stepping forward. I'll go. He turned to me, his face a mix of anger and fear. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, I said, my voice steady. You saved me. Now it's my turn. The plan was chaos from the start. The shard pulsed violently in its containment chamber as I carried it into the woods, the figures closing in around me. The hum of the void was deafening, and the light ahead grew brighter, drawing me toward it. When I reached the shimmer, I hesitated. Its form twisted and rippled, larger and more menacing than ever. But I didn't have time to be afraid. I activated the detonator and hurled the shard into the void. The explosion was blinding, a flash of light so intense it burned the shadows from the trees. The hum stopped, replaced by an ear-splitting silence. And then, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back at the base. Moore was standing over me, her face etched with exhaustion. You did it, she said quietly. The lights are gone. The figures, they just stopped. Whatever you did, it worked. Montgomery was sitting nearby, his face pale but alive. He gave me a small nod, and for the first time in months, I let myself hope. The fight wasn't over. The world was scarred, and the replacements were still out there. But for now, we'd won. And for the first time, we knew how to fight back.